Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this evening's Civil Discourse series on U.S. immigration policy. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors for tonight. Our presenting sponsor for the Civil Discourse series, the Meadows Foundation, and our event sponsor, Celia and Larry Schoenbrunn. Thank you so much for your support of the museum and our programs. We're also grateful for the support of our community partners for this program: Big Brothers Big Sisters Lone Star, Congregation Anshe Torah, Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture, Mosaic Family Services, Resource Center, Southwest Jewish Congress, Temple Shalom, and the Bridge Homeless Recovery Center. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our museum members and our board members joining us tonight. We couldn't put on programs like this without your incredible support, so thank you so much for all you do. The goal of the Civil Discourse series is to have a respectful dialogue about some thought-provoking topics, and that seems pretty hard to do these days. We see our role in the community not only as an educator, but also as a convener, serving as a place where we can gather to learn from one another. And we do hope to foster civil discourse through this program. Tonight, we will discuss U.S. immigration policy, a topic that I know is top of mind for many of us. We will leave plenty of time for questions at the end of the program. And as always, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type out your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce our incredible panel for this evening. Justice Clint Bolick serves on the Arizona Supreme Court. He also serves as a research fellow on the Immigration Reform Team with the Hoover Institution. Justice Bolick is a prolific author of dozens of books and hundreds of articles, including Immigration Wars, Forging an American Solution, co-authored with former Florida Governor Jeb Bush. Laura Collins serves as director, Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. Ms. Collins previously served as the director of immigration policy at the American Action Forum. She has experience in politics, working as a senior research analyst at the Republican National Committee for the 2012 election cycle and in the Texas House of Representatives for the 82nd legislature. And Laura A. Hernandez joined the faculty of Baylor Law School in 2008, following 11 years as a litigator at firms in Los Angeles, San Antonio, and Dallas. She currently teaches immigration law, remedies, insurance law, civil rights actions, and separation of church and state. Professor Hernandez's legal scholarship to date has focused on constitutional issues facing immigrants to the U.S. And our moderator tonight is Stella M. Chavez, the immigration and demographics reporter at KERA, our local public radio station. At KERA, she's written and produced several multi-part projects, including Generation One, about immigrant students in North Texas, and The Race to Save Failing Schools, about schools trying to meet state academic standards. Thank you all so much for being a part of this program tonight and for sharing your expertise with us. I know we'll learn so much. And now I will turn things over to our panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be here, and I want to welcome all our wonderful panelists. I want to start off, and also thank you to everyone who is with us virtually tonight. Hopefully one of these days we'll be able to all meet in person, hopefully soon. I want to start by having each of you introduce yourselves. If you could just take a couple of minutes to briefly talk about what you do and how you approach the topic of immigration in your work. And Clint, would you like to go first?
Sure. I am honored to serve as a justice on the Arizona Supreme Court. that does not put me in contact with immigration issues. Very often, I think we've only had 2 immigration cases, both relating to state law in my 6 years on the court. But prior to that, as was mentioned in my introduction, I co-authored a book with Jeb Bush called Immigration Wars. I happen to have a copy of it right here. Beautiful cover. Jeb, during his presidential campaign, quipped a couple of times during the debates that you could buy it for $1 as long as you were on Amazon, as long as you were willing to pay shipping and handling. But that book was written in 2013, and very depressingly, every single policy prescription is still on the table and in desperate need of enactment. Literally nothing significant has changed in terms of immigration reform. And I would say very succinctly that the 2 principles that we advocated in our book to guide immigration reform and immigration policy were, first of all, that we are a nation of immigrants, that immigrants are our lifeblood, and that we need to have a policy that continues to welcome immigrants to the American dream. And the second principle is that our immigration policy has to be governed by the rule of law, that we are a sovereign nation, that we have the right and the responsibility to control our borders. And if you put those 2 things together, a passionately pro-immigration view combined with the rule of law, I think that the policy prescriptions that will finally fix this vexing issue really state themselves, and we'll get into much more detail as time goes on.
Thank you so much, Clint. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. I am Professor Laura Hernandez. I am a tenured law professor at Baylor. When I joined the faculty in 2008, I noticed, and it had been the first time that I had spent a significant amount of time in Central Texas. And to my surprise, I realized that there was a large immigrant population in Waco and the surrounding communities. And even though I was a big law corporate defense, I felt like our law school and our students would be interested and have a passion to assisting this immigrant community with some of their immigration needs. And so thus began the Baylor Law Immigration Clinic. And I would agree with Clint completely that our nation absolutely was formed, and its greatness is largely due to the migrant population. But interestingly enough, history tells us that the first wave of any migrant population does not have it easy. So even in a melting pot, it's very difficult for that first wave, and that has always been the case here in the United States. So I think that that combined with the fact that we have to have a functioning system of regulation and rules regarding migration, well, unfortunately, not enough attention has been paid to that need. And so because we've kicked the can down the road, it's approaching condition critical. And I think that's why we're here together to talk about these issues, because we have to do something now. We don't have any more time. And serving this population the way that our students do, that our clinic does, really kind of tells, I guess I get to watch the human price that is being paid for not addressing these issues. So I completely agree that reform is so needed.
Thank you, Laura. And we'll turn to another Laura Collins.
Thank you. And thank you guys so much for having me here tonight. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. At the Bush Institute, we really believe in developing leaders, advancing policy, and taking action to solve today's most pressing challenges. And the pressing challenge that I get to work on every day is immigration. And I really just love this topic so much because I really deeply believe that America benefits from immigration. And we've worked on immigration policy at the Bush Institute since the Institute was founded when President Bush and Mrs. Bush left office. It's always been done here from an economics perspective. We believe that immigration is part of pro-growth economic policy. But with the release of President Bush's book, Out of Many One, as you can see behind me, we really started to think about this topic in a broader lens. We really do believe we have more to say. And so we have policy recommendations on a reasonable solution for the undocumented. We talk about the importance of America being a leader on humanitarian migration. We want to take a fresh approach to border security that thinks about more than the border as just a place of security and walls and migration. Really, the border is about so much more than that. And there's so much trade and commerce and vibrant culture that happens at the border. And we still keep that essence rooted in the economics, because we really do think that immigration is just one of those vibrant pieces that really helps our economy to grow. And so we want solutions that are based on facts, oriented towards solving problems and politically viable, right? I mean, we would love to see something bipartisan. We would love Congress to actually come together on a solution. But we also recognize that there's some limits to that. And so, we spend a lot of our time just talking and researching and writing and trying to have these really good, deep discussions on a topic that we think is so deeply important to the United States.
Thank you for that, Laura. So I want to start, thank you all for those introductions. I want to start with just some basics because I think everyone's knowledge of immigration or immigration policy, varies. So if you could, can you describe how someone comes to the US, how someone immigrates to the US, like what systems are in place that determine if someone is allowed to, move here from another country? And then secondly, what would you change if you could, or would you change any aspect of that process or the screening process in particular, if you could?
Well, I can start, and please, if my co-panelists would like to interject, please do. So the process of immigrating to the United States, there are two main pillars. One is asylum. And so that's a process where a migrant can come to the border and claim a fear of persecution and enter into the asylum process. The other pillar is the immigration side. And this is where you apply for a visa, colloquially, a green card. And in order to do so, you would need to fall into a specific preference category. So either you would have a qualifying family relationship, you would have a qualifying employment offer from a United States employer, and then the last category, which is very rarely discussed, is the diversity category, which is a lottery system that the United States has implemented in order to encourage migration from countries that don't send a lot of immigrants to the United States. So that one doesn't really get a lot of attention, but those are the ways into the United States that are lawful and will result in a documented presence. I would say, just to start off in terms of what I would change, what I think what we're beginning to see is, or what we have seen for a long time, is that the process of the allocation of visas is not working. It is imperfect. And what has happened is that we have a lot of demand for these visas from countries that are close to us geographically, but not enough visas. And so what that has turned out to practically mean is that there is no lawful way for some people to enter into the United States in a documented sense, either because the wait is too long, they don't have a qualifying family relationship, they don't qualify for an employment offer. And if you don't have any other way to get to the United States other than to migrate here in an undocumented status, well, I mean, you know, that really sort of clears up the picture for you and encourages undocumented migration. And so that is the first thing that really needs to be looked at very heavily in order to encourage lawful migration. You know, if there is no path to lawful migration, well, then people will come unlawfully, in an undocumented fashion.
Stella, I agree with everything that Laura said. One of the most important things, and our book, Immigration Wars, is designed not only to be a reform proposal, but also a basic primer on how our immigration system works or doesn't work, because the vast majority of Americans don't understand it. The vast majority of elected officials don't understand it. And one of the most important things to understand about our immigration system, typically we hear the refrain, why don't these people just get in line? One of the most important things to understand about our immigration policy is there is no line. There's lots of backlog, but there's not simply a line that people can get into who want to come to the United States. And our immigration policy as it currently exists is older than I am. It dates back to the 1950s. It's been patched, but it's never been reformed. And certainly our reality in the year 2021 is quite different than our reality was in the mid 1950s. A lot of people also don't realize you have to fit into one of these categories, as Laura said. What a lot of people don't realize is that in the 1970s, we changed our system to be primarily a family-based immigration system rather than an economics-based immigration system. In the 1970s, and I suspect Laura Collins will have a lot to say about this as well, we expanded the definition of family preferences beyond the nuclear family to include parents and siblings. And what that did was to create a system that colloquially is now known as chain migration, where with the extended family, then more and more family preferences became available, so that over 2/3 of our legal immigrants today are family members. Only roughly 14% come for work or entrepreneurship. This is a stark difference from 1970, when roughly 70% of our immigrants came for economics purposes. So the main change that Jeb Bush and I advocated was to try to shift that as much as possible to a system that prioritized immigrants coming for work or entrepreneurship purposes. And we desperately need that. When we look at our employment situation today, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be great if we had skilled and unskilled workers coming in at a young age? And secondly, that we create opportunities for more immigrants to come, and this gets to Laura Hernandez's point, who just want to be Americans. If we create a line, if we create a method, we'll stop coming illegally. And so we would reduce family preferences to the nuclear family, that is children, minor children, and spouses. And then other family members could come through the normal process. This would open up literally hundreds of thousands of opportunities for workers at both the unskilled level and the highly skilled level, as well as opportunities for people to migrate, many more opportunities for people to migrate legally.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what has been said are things that we've proposed as well. And I think one of the things that's really important in this is when you think about those employment-based categories and people who are able to come here for work, we reserved about 10,000 a year for people with less than a bachelor's degree, which just does not make sense given what our labor market looks like, right? And those are the sorts of people who they absolutely have skills. They absolutely can contribute. They're very successful here if given the opportunity, but it's not just that green card system that doesn't really work on their behalf. It's also that temporary worker visa system that is just inadequate for a lot of the people who have the ability to come here and contribute. Maybe they don't want to stay permanently, but they do want to have an opportunity to work and support their family because we know that's what they're doing. So there's sort of two big categories of changes, right? There's immigration policy changes, more employment-based green cards, changes a little bit on the margins to the family-based system, although family reunification is such an important part of the way we've done immigration in this country for such a long time that trying to erode that too much, I think, is probably going to cause some political issues. And so we really do leave that piece up to Congress, right? That's some changes that they need to make. We probably need to have more green cards overall. Because just the nature of the number of people that we bring in per year. I think there was, I think it's 37% increase we could sustain really without a lot of issues. And that was a study done by the National Immigration Forum. But there's some really practical changes that we could also make. USCIS, that's US Citizenship and Immigration Service, the vast majority of the forms that they have for people who are trying to immigrate here are not available electronically. For the ones that are available electronically, they don't talk to the systems that attorneys use. We had a situation, if you've been watching the news at all, on Afghanistan and people trying to evacuate Afghanistan. There's a lot of people caught in this sort of weird bureaucratic back and forth. If you want to claim refugee status and try to get protection here, you have to be able to leave Afghanistan first, which is a longstanding piece of refugee policy. But you can file some paperwork before you get out. But the problem is, if you qualified for any sort of visa or green card, you have to finish with that consular interview. There are no embassy or consular services in Afghanistan currently. In order to get out of Afghanistan, the Taliban wants you to have a visa, but you can't complete that process until you get out. So there's this real push and pull that happens. And this was an issue even before the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. We saw during COVID, so many embassies were closed or just had restricted services. And that really did create this drag on the number of green cards that were issued in the last year. We've seen, I think it's up close to 100,000 were not issued. And so those are people who've been waiting in line. They've done all the paperwork, they've jumped through all the hoops. And because we don't have systems that really work efficiently, they're not really able to access the things that they are entitled to by having followed the rules that we've laid out for them. And that undermines the rule of law too. And, the last thing I think I would say on this is that these are not things that, that should be hard. We should be able to bring this system into the 21st century. But we have had this hesitation as a government to get this moving, because I think there is always this concern that to change something, make it more technological, make it more remote, would reduce the amount of security. And we know that security vetting piece on immigration works really, really well. Immigrants have very low levels of crime. They are very unlikely to be terrorists. I mean, we just know this from the statistics. And so we know the security piece on immigration policy works really well. It's just that efficiency piece and the meeting the needs of this country, both economically and in other ways. It just doesn't work right. And so we really do need to undertake reforms on both sides, one to the policy and one to the practical.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you all. It's interesting you mentioned the number of, I think I was reading today about the number of unused green cards that I guess should have been issued before the end of the last fiscal year, which ended last week, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to kind of, this sort of ties into that a little bit. But our country has had a long history of I guess quotas or per country caps. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what can are the numbers that are set now reasonable? I've heard from many people who have said, let's get rid of that per country cap. And I'd like to hear from each of you what you think should be done regarding that.
Well, I'll go first. I really think we need to change them. We either need to eliminate them or to, to reduce some pressure on them, right? Change the dynamics there. And I understand that some of the per country cap was designed to sort of create a fairness in a way, right? I mean, every country has the same cap and it's designed to really make sure that, not one country has an advantage over another. But all it has done is create this very strange system in which there are Mexicans, for example, in line for 20 years. There are Filipinos in line for 20 years. There are Indians who are in line sometimes for 100 years. But if you're from a country with historically lower levels of immigration to the United States, you know, your wait time is probably really just about the paperwork processing and not actually a long line, because you're probably not hitting that cap every year. And this is kind of a tough question, because fundamentally these future flow questions, right? Like who we bring in and where they're from and what skills and abilities they have, those are all trade-offs. And those are ultimately things Congress has to make tough decisions on. They're going to have to pick some winners and losers. With the per country cap system, we've already done that. And so how they move forward and fix that, they'll ultimately choose new winners and losers, but they're going to have to address it at some point.
And I would agree with what Laura Collins has to say. I think that what's important to know about here is that there is a pie, if you will, of available visas. And the number of available visas every year is set by Congress. And they could make it bigger. They could make it smaller. It is in their hands. And what Congress has chosen to do, even though sometimes in certain years there is a heavy demand, say for certain employment visas from certain countries, they refuse to make the pie bigger. So instead what they do is they recut it. And they recut it in response usually to some sort of pressure from, employers or whomever, but they never really solved the problem. And so with these per country limits, in essence, I think it makes a certain amount of common sense that most of the immigrants who want to come to the United States are geographically close to us. And so sure enough, in terms of the family sponsored visas, you see huge waiting times, from Mexico, from Central America, where there is a lot of demand. And the sad part about that, speaking to Laura's previous point, is that we have an employment demand for these migrants, the unskilled worker. On the one hand, these immigrants are demonized for taking our jobs. On the other hand, no American wants to do that work. And as a result, what American employers do is hire undocumented workers who have come in. And this is a terrible solution for a couple of reasons. It leaves those immigrants susceptible to exploitation. They're vulnerable and they can be abused and trafficked as a result of that. In terms of just the American population, I mean, it is just, it seems like we're taking the benefits of their work and, they're also paying taxes, but yet not, being able to get a refund or anything like that. And we are not offering them anything in return, essentially. And so if the United States has a need for their employment and need for their presence, then it seems only right that we should give them a path to being here lawfully. So in terms of winners or losers, that's absolutely right. That if the pie isn't going to get any bigger, there are certainly going to be winners and losers. And I think what we as a country have to acknowledge is that we need skilled workers, we need unskilled workers. As a country, we do prize family connections. We want people to bring their immediate family here. So if these are our priorities, then our Congress needs to act to recognize those priorities and put them in place. And if that is done, then I think that we would see the undocumented population begin to fall. What has not worked is ignoring that part of the problem and then periodically allowing a path to residency to those who are undocumented who've been here for a certain number of time. The idea behind that was always, well, they will now be documented and problem solved. Well, no, because that undocumented migration is still happening. And so the population shrinks and then it expands. And right now we're in a situation where the population has really expanded again. So I think the country quotas, adjusting those would be the first step. Unfortunately, I'm not very hopeful about that. I don't know what Clint thinks.
The country quotas have an invidious history, and they were initially designed to preserve as much white European immigration as possible, and they became outmoded because there weren't a lot of Europeans clamoring anymore to come to the United States, and largely were discarded. They still exist in parts of the family immigration system, which is why certain countries have such incredible backlogs because they are capped. But I agree with what's been said. We need to start looking at things that work for us. For example, not very long ago, when a number of states clamped down on illegal immigration, what we saw was tremendous economic dislocation, particularly in southern agricultural states. When there was no way to get people to pick crops in Alabama and Georgia, those crops died on the vines. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, Americans will take those jobs. They absolutely did not take those jobs. And they weren't just eliminating agricultural jobs, which moved to Central America and frankly to China as well. They also destroyed upstream middle-class food processing jobs. And so this is when we artificially distort market forces and prevent the supply of labor from coming here legally, we're simply going to export jobs to other countries. And that's true at the upper level, the STEM jobs as well. There were billboards put up in Silicon Valley saying, can't get a green card? Come to Canada. And people were migrating to what was called Silicon Valley in Chile. We had two moments over the last 2 decades when these problems could have been fixed. One was right before 9/11, when the Bush administration had an opportunity and was seizing the opportunity to have bipartisan immigration reform. Then 9/11 happened, and that set us back horribly. The other was the Gang of 12, which came together, 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats, determined to fix these problems. Reforming family, extended family migration was part of the compromise. And unfortunately, the extremes on both parties torpedoed that reform measure as well. So we've got to continue talking about ways that are compromises that reflect American priorities, not just family, though of course family is super important, but our economic needs as well.
So I just wanted to say one last point, we can move on. I think it was late 2019, the Senate passed a bill to alleviate per country caps on a bipartisan basis, and then nothing else happened with it. And no one's really championed that as an issue in Congress since then. And so we have this kind of strange place on immigration policy where it either goes in little bits and pieces and gets a little bit of traction, and then the champion decides that it's not worth their time anymore because it takes so much political capital to get it done, or we try to push these really big comprehensive bills. And so the last time that I've really seen anything, aside from the funding for Afghan evacuees that just passed and the continuing resolution, the last time I really saw something productive happen on immigration was this per country caps bill, but obviously it didn't end up in front of a president for signature.
You know, and I will say this too, Laura, even when there is a lot of support amongst the citizenry for some sort of immigration reform. And so what I am remembering is, or what I know of, is the path to residency for the DACA kids or the Dreamers. I mean, literally nobody opposes that. Yet they are still unable to create that path to residency. And so I think what we're seeing is that immigration, in essence, is just being taken hostage because non-citizens don't vote. So they're sort of an easy target. And, you know, there is very little, I think, blowback politically if you decide to, you know, not be cooperative. But the real victims are all of us, because this problem continues to go on, and it exacts an emotional toll, it exacts an economic toll, and politically, we just can't get our act together.
Yeah, thank you all. That all is very interesting. And Clint, you mentioned, you know, right before September 11th, and I remember that really well, that moment, because I was a very young, very green reporter in South Florida and had just been asked by my editor to work on a story or a series of stories about that possibility of, you know, immigration reform. So September 11th happened, and it was obviously it was a horrible time for everyone, but I clearly remember, you know, also being disappointed because here, you know, was this opportunity to cover something, you know, historic or potentially historic, and it, you know, it didn't happen. But that aside, I think, like, you know, you also mentioned, Clint, about the impact that I think, you know, recent or in the last few years, I guess, stepped up enforcement by local governments or state governments have had on what if impact that's had on immigration or on the number of immigrants either coming or going. And I'm wondering, like, what role you all think that local and state governments have in enforcing immigration? Is there some kind of balance there that, you know, is there something reasonable that local and state governments can do? Can local, state, and federal governments all work together, or should they stay out of it completely and leave it to the federal government?
Well, Stella, I'm going to broaden that question, because I actually think that giving states a bigger role could be one of the potential both political and real world solutions to the immigration, the crisis that we have now with immigration and immigration policy, and enforcement is a part of it. But an idea that has been floated by both Republicans and Democrats is to give states a larger role in adding to the number of immigrants that would come into their states. A lot of people don't know that immigration policy was primarily a state matter until the 20th century. And, you know, federalism has really been helping us in all sorts of ways when we come to loggerheads, whether it's abortion federalism, COVID federalism, education federalism. States are reflecting the values of their people. And I think if we allowed this to happen to a certain extent in immigration, we would see federalism operating as a release valve for a lot of the pressures in this area. For example, the Pacific Northwest states might like to add, in fact, they would like to add lots more STEM immigrants, people who have high skilled degrees. Southeastern states and Texas might like to see, well, certainly Texas would be in that category as well, but they may also like to see more agricultural workers. And an idea that's been put forward on both sides of the aisle is to allow states to add specific numbers of immigrants in specific areas, and to essentially be responsible for monitoring them, but basically addressing whatever the priorities might be in those particular states. That, I think, allowing states to make those decisions over and above federal policy, I think could relieve some of the pressure on this issue. On the flip side, especially as we're seeing more and more immigrants who have come illegally being dispersed into the population, local law enforcement involvement is absolutely essential. There's got to be a very, very tight relationship between the federal immigration authorities and local authorities in terms of immigrants who are here illegally when they commit crimes, having a very close relationship with the federal authorities for deportation purposes. And we need that both from a local law enforcement perspective as well as to deal with a federal problem. I agree with Laura Collins emphatically that most people coming across the border are doing so for economic opportunities, educational opportunities, or whatever, and they commit fewer crimes. But those who do commit crimes should be very, very rapidly deported. And again, doing this in a highly visible way, I think will reduce the concerns that ordinary Americans have with regard to illegal immigration. And until they perceive that that problem is being effectively dealt with, we can't talk about increasing the number of visas because it simply gets all lumped together in a way that is very susceptible to demagogic opposition to immigration reform.
Clint, you before I get to you, Laura, both Lauras, just something I want to follow up on with you, or perhaps Laura Collins or Laura Hernandez, you could answer this. The idea of, I guess, allowing states or giving states an opportunity, perhaps to determine or set, a certain number of immigrants who can come to their, state, perhaps if there's a need for more agricultural workers or STEM workers is an interesting one. But I wonder, in at least in a state like Texas, we have seen our state government, our state leaders act pretty aggressively toward immigrants. And I'm just wondering, I'm just throwing out this question, if left up to the states, if the other extreme might happen in that some might say, we don't want anyone to come to Texas, for example.
I think it's essential that the federal immigration policy would be the baseline. This would be allowing states only to move in one direction, and that is to bring in additional immigrants to serve their state's economic needs, whether they're agricultural, whether they're hospitality, whether they're STEM, whether they're physicians, et cetera. Where I first saw this idea, and now I'm really embarrassed that I can't remember the governor's name, but it was the immediate predecessor to the current Michigan governor, who said, I need to repopulate Detroit. And guess what? Nobody's moving there. And we need entrepreneurs from all around the world. And he asked for permission to bring thousands of immigrants into Detroit, sell them houses that are on the government rolls for really low cost, and bring entrepreneurial investments with them. Of course, there is no mechanism for that to happen today. And each state is different. Many states, I suspect my own state, would say, nah, we have enough. We're not going to take more. But they're not allowed to say, well, we're going to take less. But they can say, our needs are great in a particular area. And I think allowing this sort of experimentation, this sort of above and beyond would be a very exciting and positive experiment in American federalism.
It's the Canadian model, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually,
that's how Canada does it. And I mean, obviously Canada is competing very closely with us for top talent. And so it's something worth thinking about. And I think Utah actually explored this idea as well.
Well,
yes.
I should say, though, that I can't be quite as optimistic about that because, first of all, there are problems with the Canadian model. There have been, where they have had sort of guest worker type programs. So I'm not sure if you mean by adding to the visas, if you mean bringing in guest workers temporarily, or whether you mean bringing in additional people and handing them a green card, basically. But if what you're thinking of is more of a guest worker program, we have already experimented with that and it did not end well. And I'm referring to the Bracero program that actually existed back in the 30s and 40s, where guest workers were brought in to do the unskilled labor that was necessary, and then made promises and then were abruptly deported, some without being paid. And so that was a disaster. And unfortunately, I just don't think that the states that would be, I guess, on the front lines of making these decisions, Texas, Arizona, you know, any state along the southern border, I mean, I can't help but think that that it won't end well, simply because of history, that that the states that are interested in the immigration issue are usually fairly hostile and are more interested in exploitation versus we have a need for this labor, let's be fair about it, let's have a fair system. And I think that's why the federal government has, you know, not allowed the states to be very big actors, because it would promote an inconsistent policy and that would have foreign policy implications. So I am not so sure that I kind of am very pessimistic that the states would be able to correct the problem. But I guess, Clint, are you saying with this that they would be able to hand out more green cards, or were you thinking more of a guest program?
So the idea, first of all, some of the greatest voices for immigration reform around the time of the unsuccessful Gang of 12 effort were Southern agricultural commissioners who were desperate to fix the problem. Very conservative. I think all of them were Republican, and yet because they saw the dynamics of a dying industry in their states, they really were very, very reform-minded. So the Bracero program, of course, an utter disaster. And however, what we proposed in Immigration Wars was a system where basically whether the states were doing this on their own initiative or the federal government, would be a program where the employer was responsible for the employees, would essentially apply for a certain number of guest workers. The guest workers would come in, and after a certain number of years, if they came back and they desired to pursue a green card, we would be test driving these individuals to see that they are law-abiding, hardworking, tax-paying individuals. And after 5 years or so, then they would be eligible for green cards. Of course, many of them, perhaps most of them, aren't interested in that. They want to return to their home country during the part of the year when they're not employed. But we wouldn't allow states to make those rules. They would be a part of, again, the federal baseline, but they would simply alert the federal government that they would like to have additional workers in a particular category, and they would be allowed to go above and beyond.
Well, I know that one of the criticisms of the Canadian program that this sounds very similar to, even if it's not identical, is that when the employers took on that responsibility, they were actually not allowing the workers to leave the employment premises. So in essence, they lost their freedom.
You can solve that by attaching the visa to the worker instead of the employer, but there hasn't been a lot of appetite for doing that either.
Right. Yeah. I mean, exactly. I mean, so the idea was that the employer was to be trusted, and then they immediately exploited a vulnerable population. But if the worker could actually transfer the visa to employers, you know, that would curb that. So, and that's been a problem
with the STEM visas as well. Spouses aren't allowed to work. You're not allowed to change employers. It's like indentured servitude. So we we advocated changing that and making it much more flexible. The whole point of this is to make our labor market more flexible, not less flexible, and that would require not allowing employers to exploit. Certainly, they want to recoup what is a ridiculously high investment in those high-end visas, but putting clamps on the workers, the dynamism of the marketplace is certainly not something you want to sacrifice.
Now, Laura, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that. I do want to, before we do, I want to just ask one more question before we turn to our Q&A, questions from the audience. Laura, did you want to add anything to what Clint and Laura Hernandez said?
Well, I would just say on the law enforcement cooperation piece, I think this ends up being slightly controversial for a couple of reasons, right? I mean, there's obviously, there's concerns about local and state police not having the same sort of training. There's concerns about racial profiling. But I think one of the things that's important here is that I do believe that cooperation is an important piece of this, but I think this requires the federal government to really trust local law enforcement when they say that they have a neighborhood or a situation or a relationship with an immigrant community that is good, right? We don't want to be in a position where we're dictating to local law enforcement that they need to go on a raid, that they need to do. They have relationships, they know how to police their communities. And while it's imperfect, I do trust that there are motivations for law enforcement to have good relationships with their immigrant communities. And so we need to make sure that we're listening to them when they say, this is a good community. This is not a place where we really need to be concerned about this population.
Thanks, Laura. So last question before we turn to Q&A is, we can't talk about immigration without talking about the current situation on our border. This is true in here in Texas and Arizona, Clint, where you are. I'm wondering, just how you see the current situation and how our policies, what policies should be in place if they aren't already to address, the number of migrants who are coming and wanting to enter, either coming from Mexico, Central America, or other places. And as we saw recently, Haiti as well.
Well, I'll go first if that's okay. I really think that what we see at the border is just a symptom of the fact that our immigration system simply doesn't work. It doesn't have enough opportunities for people to come. That's why you see people coming to request asylum, because they know it is their one chance. It's not transparent. It's not easy for someone to understand who's not in the system. We know it's supposedly designed so that you can navigate your way through it as an individual without an attorney. We know that's false. Most people pay thousands of dollars in attorney's fees to try to make sure that they don't make a mistake. We know it's a system that's not based in compliance, so the risk is so high. If you make a mistake, that's your legal opportunity just disappears. And we know that it is a system where we are not adequately working with our regional allies and partners, because this is going to be an issue that we are seeing for the next decade plus. We have record levels of global displacement. One of the successes of the last several years is that very few people live in the lowest levels of poverty. That means they have the means to migrate, and they will, because they know there are opportunities in other places. We're going to see economies recover at different rates from COVID, and how we decide to manage this situation rather than just continuing to turn people away, relying on our allies and partners, not just on enforcement, but on resettlement, and really trying to make sure as a region, we take a hard look at how this migration strategy works and make sure that we are accounting for the dignity of these people who don't really have a lot of options where they're from, and trying to make the best of a situation that's going to be difficult, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but across the globe.
And I would also say that another problem that we have is that the process that we have in place has simply just blown up. So the asylum process is based on the ability of our immigration courts to adjudicate these requests for asylum. And, you know, in order for it to really function properly, it needs to function in a somewhat timely way. We have a backlog in the immigration courts right now that I believe that you're very lucky if you get in front of an immigration judge in under 2 years at this point, and that there are some immigration courts with backlogs up to 10 years. And so how can our process really function when what we have in place is so incapable of handling these influx of asylum requests? So there are a couple of reasons for that backlog. Number one, there's not enough immigration judges. But number two is exactly what Laura said, that we are getting more and more requests for asylum, different waves of migrants asking for asylum at the southern border, and that is not going to change. And COVID, climate migration, all of these things are just going to add to this. So either we hire a lot more immigration judges, get those backlogs done, and then just work the system we have in place, or we would have to change asylum laws. And frankly, there's a lot of sentiment that we should just let in a lot more refugees, that we have the capacity for that. But, you know, in terms of a broken system, I think that you can't find a better example of a broken migration system than the asylum process at this point in time.
And I would just add three brief points. First, it's a vicious cycle. You desperately need a reformed system across the board. And yet the conversation will not start in earnest and in a bipartisan way until people feel like there is a commitment to the rule of law at the border. And so you can't really fix one without fixing the other. The second is that it appears that our interventions in Central American countries to try to fix some of the problems that were leading to diasporas, particularly gang violence, seem to be working fairly well. You know, we won't have as much a problem at the border if people are not fleeing their countries. And those efforts were abruptly ended. And then we saw a resurgence. I think that efforts to, whether it's helping Mexico tame the drug cartels or efforts to help Central American countries curb gang violence, those sorts of things, I think, really can be very, very good investments, because if we don't stem the tide, then we're going to be dealing with them at our border and inside our borders. And then finally, one problem that is often overlooked is that most illegal immigrants, or certainly a large portion, are people who come legally and overstay their visas. And this is one area where you would think that we would be able to make progress, because establishing biometric identification for people who come into the country and having some ability to track whether they've left or not ought to be really simple, and it still hasn't happened after all of these years. And so that's a part of illegal immigration that we often don't examine, and the fact that we don't know where visa overstayers are, or even who they are, is really a menace to our security.
I would just add to that, you know, I think one of the things that would make that overstay issue a little different is if we had a system that allowed people who did overstay to comply, right?
Yes.
So that they didn't, you know, right now, if you couldn't pay the fee or the paperwork was backlogged, you know, we're going to deport you based on that. And that's not a good system, right? That's not one that encourages people to come forward and declare who they are. And the other thing I would say is, I feel like this is a question that always focuses on the technology. And I don't know anymore that that is really where the issue is. I'm not sure Americans have an appetite for the trade-off of civil liberties that would have to be in place in order to adequately track people on visas in the way that we would need to in order to know where they are and find them and deport them. I think that that's such a sticky issue. And I think that's part of the reason we haven't really seen much progress there, is that it makes people a little queasy on the civil liberties.
Well, and of course, I am talking about people who are coming into the United States. When we go to Europe, we give them our thumbprint on the way in.
And we do biometrics on people who come in, right? But we don't know where we don't really track how they leave.
Yes,
It's
and
an honor
I
system.
think that for people who are non-citizens, that presents probably less of a concern, though I am very much a civil libertarian, but I think it presents less of a concern.
Thanks, you guys. So I think we'll turn now to questions from the audience. Thanks again to everybody who's been listening or watching virtually, and to the questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So the first question is, it says, for people who are already in the country and seeking citizenship, should any weight be given to their level of community and civic involvement? Laura Hernandez, Laura Collins.
Yes, right. I mean, and I obviously don't want to speak too much about this, but one of the things that we think is so important about a path to citizenship for the undocumented is that it allows people to be full participants in their community, right? It's not just their opportunities, but their rights and responsibilities. And so if you have evidence that you've been a good contributor to that civic fabric, I think that's an important thing that shows that you have what it takes to be a good resident here and a good American.
And as a matter of fact, any application for adjustment to permanent residency or to become a citizen, there is a category, if you will, called good moral character. And good moral character is exactly that. It's civic involvement. It's it's complying with the law. There are sometimes, though, some problems with good moral character, because what you might have is a non-citizen, a child, say, in middle school or high school, and at one point in time, which was quite different from when I was in those grades, admittedly, before the dawn of time, that when you would, when kids would begin to fight, or, there would be, teenage angst or turmoil, what I remember happening is that you usually got suspended or you had detention. You had to stay after school. But what has been happening in more recent times is that these children are being handed tickets by juvenile officers, where they actually have to go and stand before a juvenile court judge and say, well, this is why I was fighting, and I swear I won't do this anymore. Well, when you have that kind of history, it actually hurts your good moral character. So good moral character has been one of those iffy things that we have to be very careful about, especially with the immigration clinic, when we're providing services and trying to help people show that they qualify for, a visa or a DACA card or for citizenship. If they have anything like that, we have to provide substantial documentation that, they understand that was wrong and that they'll never do it again. And here are all the wonderful things that they've done in their community since. And so it is a sort of double-edged sword, but it is very much a consideration in any application for a lawful stay in the United States.
I would add to that, in the book Immigration Wars, we strongly supported the DREAM Act. We thought that it should be actually passed by Congress rather than implemented through executive order. We worried that the next president, whoever it might be, might change that policy, and sure enough, that worry was prescient. But with regard to adults who came into the United States illegally, The rule of law component, the rule of law principle, I think dictates that there has to be a consequence for that. We want people to come out of the shadows. We want people to be productive members of their community. But as a result, we did not advocate an immediate path to citizenship, but rather an immediate path to permanent residency. Ultimately, having a possibility to convert that in circumstances that are warranted is definitely a good idea, especially if it does involve benefit value to the community. But in terms of a short-term solution, if we simply have another amnesty as we did in the 1980s, a lot of people are going to not support the kinds of reforms to the system that I think are necessary.
It's because you're taking a shortcut, right? You're taking a shortcut by doing a form of amnesty, but you're not solving the problem. And so I guess to me, that's like another version of kicking the can down the road.
Well, I would say though that a lot of the proposals to legalize and put on a path to citizenship being documented over the last 20 years or so have all involved hurdles, right? There's paying back taxes, there's paying restitution, there's fees and fines, there's waiting periods. The 2013 bill had a trigger that Congress had to certify that the border was 90% secure or something like that. Like, these are things that are built in. The political conversation doesn't capture that at all, right? It is either, it's an all or nothing. But Congress has always put these things in, at least in recent memory. They've learned from 1986. And so, it is one of those points that I think gets lost because it's in the weeds of the policy. It's not an easy talking point. It's not something that a lot of people can go out and run a campaign on, but it's definitely built in.
I agree.
Thanks, you guys. On to the next question. And I want to apologize. I just got an alert that my internet connection is a little unstable. So I apologize in advance if I cut in and out, but hopefully it's okay so far. Let me make sure I can read this. Okay, the next question is, has there been any consideration to allowing community organizations or individuals to sponsor asylum seekers or, quote, economic migrants? Might this be a way to address waves of migration from certain countries experiencing turmoil?
I think the closest we've got in recent memory is...
Laura, do you want to, or I'm sorry, Clint, or...
No, Laura, please.
Yeah, I think the closest we've got in recent memory is the Biden administration put out, they consulted with Congress, and they put out their document about the refugee ceiling for the next fiscal year. And one of the things they put in there is working towards private sponsorship of refugees, something that Canada already does. Currently, that's not an option in the United States, and that's about the closest we've gotten. I don't know that would extend to asylum seekers, but it's an interesting innovation that would, I think, really, really help us along. There's another sort of little quirk in U.S. immigration law, that's humanitarian parole, and you can have private sponsors for people who have either a significant public benefit or humanitarian reasons for needing parole, which is basically a process by which DHS says they can come into the country even though they don't have a visa yet.
Sorry. Does anyone else want to chime in, or should we go on to the next question?
I love the idea.
So sadly, we're now on to our final question. I know a lot of you, we couldn't get to your questions, but please feel free to reach out to us. I'm available on social media, online, email. I think this so far has been a great discussion. As you can see, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to immigration policy. So our final question says, immigration is a highly politicized topic with people often arguing along party or ideological lines. Do you think this will always be the case? And is there a way to move forward in our discussion around this topic that's less politically charged?
Well, it has always been politically charged. I think what a lot of understand is that there weren't any real immigration laws until the late 1800s, and they were passed in order to curb the migration of Asian immigrants who were fleeing China from a civil war. And when we needed that Chinese labor to build the intercontinental railroad, it was tolerated. But when the railroad was finished, and then we also, of course, it coincided with an economic depression or recession in our country, then those migrants, those Asian migrants, immediately became a target. So I think it is a polarizing issue, and it certainly isn't made any better by our current political dialogue. So, we have a lot of crime. Oh, it must be those darn migrants. COVID is unchecked. Oh, it's because those migrants are bringing in disease. I mean, it seems like that the migrant is just a perfect punching bag for all of our country's ills. And unfortunately, I think until we educate ourselves as citizens as to, well, that is as absolutely a baseless accusation, and demand more from our politicians, that it's going to continue to be polarizing. But we haven't gotten away from it since the 1800s. So, I think it's going to be very difficult to do so.
Yeah, Laura's absolutely right. This is an issue, the debate over which has not changed since the 1700s. Benjamin Franklin was the original American nativist who warned about German immigrants bringing their mother tongue and their skin color. I didn't even realize that they had a different skin color and that they would never be assimilated into American society. And the debate, even involving welfare benefits, has really not advanced during that time. But fortunately, immigration policy through fits and starts has persevered despite those constant objections. And the only way I really see us coming together, I think most Americans generally favor immigration. They favor rules, fair rules regarding immigration. And tapping into that requires a great deal of political courage, which we see in very, very short supply. I think that the main way to get there is through a coalition of immigrant activist groups with business groups. These are the two groups that have the most skin in the game in terms of forging a solution. And I think that we saw the outlines of a viable systemic solution back with the Gang of 12 and the early part of the Bush administration. But it really is going to take a non-traditional coalition to pull these things together. If it's just one way or the other, we're not going to see a broad-based reform. If you can convince conservatives that we are not going to open the borders, and if you can convince immigration activists that we will move to a fairer system with a pathway to legal status, I think that we can get there.
The political lines on this feel very neatly drawn right now, and they haven't always been this way. And there really was more of a center around, between about 2006, 2007 to about 2013, 2014. And that's changed, and that will continue to change. I mean, that is the way history on immigration policy has worked. And those of us who work in this know that it's really about playing the long game. There's a really good book about the time that passed between the quota system of the mid-1920s and the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's called One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. I encourage you guys to take a look at it because it really does sort of break down those arguments and talks about the little fits and starts and the gradual progress that was made before a big reform of the system. And, I think that what's so important on this topic, and this is my call to action for all of you who are watching tonight, is that political leadership on this matters, but it doesn't have to come from the top. It can come from all of you, your leaders in your communities, your leaders in your faith organizations, your leaders in your neighborhoods and your families and your friend groups. Find ways to talk about this topic in a way that's calm, that's rational, that is based in facts, and that really accounts for the fact that you're really talking about human beings. Yes, there's going to be policies that are geared towards the economy and towards the legal system, but ultimately immigrants are people, and we should take that into consideration as we talk about the fate of these people and what it's going to do to the United States in the future. And so that is my call to action for all of you tonight.
And still, I'd like to thank the museum for sponsoring this. One of the most shameful episodes of American immigration policy was closely related to the Holocaust. So this is an issue that I think cuts very, very close to home. And I see shades of that with the attitude that many people have toward Afghani immigrants right now seeking asylum. And it's painful to see history repeating itself in ways that have very similar, potentially disastrous consequences. So we've got to learn from the past. We've got to honor our immigrant history, and we've got to put our heads together to come up with rational ways to convert our mid-20th century immigration system into a 21st century immigration system.
Thank you all for those thoughtful responses. Sorry, Laura, did you wanted to say something too?
I just feeding off what Clint said, I also think that people have to understand that this is not a zero-sum game where if the immigrant wins, American citizens lose. We all win. And if we can frame it that way, that this is going to, rise all boats, or all boats will rise with the tide, I think that, people might start to better understand the issues and the policy.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I'll just say as, someone I've covered immigration on and off throughout my career. And I feel like we're in a time, and this is true for, I think, a lot of subjects where there has been so much misinformation or lack of understanding. I mean, there's so much information coming at us, at all of us, and especially on social media. So hopefully discussions like this one, which are civil and, not everyone has to agree on every point, but hopefully more conversations like this one can help, at least create a better understanding among the public. I want to turn now to Annie. Before I do, thanks again, Laura Hernandez, Laura Collins, and Clint Bullock. I really appreciate you all participating today, and thank you to the Dallas Holocaust Museum for allowing me to moderate this discussion.
Thanks, Stella.
I will echo Stella's thanks on behalf of the museum, to our panelists, to Stella for guiding the conversation. Fascinating and enlightening conversation tonight. I'm sure we could do it for many hours more, but we appreciate you all taking the time to be with us tonight. For everyone who's watching, we appreciate you joining us. I just wanted to give another quick thank you to our sponsors, the Meadows Foundation, and Celia and Larry Schoenbrunn for supporting tonight's event. We hope everyone stays well, stays safe, and we will see everyone next time. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.